What a beautiful day to complete our dressing table. I want to get started today working on the top. Each section has two elements, a top made out of plywood edged in solid wood and a subframe to give it some thickness. The subframe is made up of 5/8 inch thick, 1.5 inch wide mahogany, and all the corners are mitered. I make the miter cuts over at the table saw. Now there are a lot of different size pieces for these frames, so I put an extension on my miter gauge, clipped off the end, measured from that point, and put indicator marks for all the different sizes that I need. I clip one end, turn it around, cut it to length. Now before we use any power tools, let's talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. To reinforce the miter joints, I'm cutting biscuit slots. I found it better to put the plate joiner in a vise with these small pieces. I had to change the cutter in the plate joiner because I'm using these very small FF biscuits, which are handy for narrow pieces. When I assemble, I'll put in a little bit of glue, and that's going to make a very strong joint. For the assembly of the frames, a little bit of glue in those slots and on the biscuits. I've set them in clamps and made sure that the edges are parallel to one another by measuring across. Now I want to check for squareness, so I take diagonal measurements. Here I have 28 9/16. Here I have 28.5, so I want to split the difference. This should be about 28.5 strong, so I'll tap this corner. Give it a couple taps. And that should do it. Now we'll set it aside to dry. These pieces are for the mirror frame. It's the same stock as the subframe. I've mitered the corners and made slots for biscuits. I also need a rabbet to receive the mirror and the backer. So I've set up my dado cutter with a sacrificial strip and a featherboard to hold everything tight to the table. Now for the plywood. I'm going to be using this piece for the top of the dressing table, but I pulled out two full sheets because this is special plywood. If you look at the grain, you can see that it's matched one piece to the next. These veneers were actually sliced out of a log in sequential order. And when it was applied to the sheets, they numbered the sheets in sequential order. So if you were to line a room with this material, it would have a very uniform grain to it. Now plywood is an interesting product. It has two skins on the outside, the fancy wood, the high quality hardwoods or even exotic woods. And it's very thin because you don't want to use any more than you have to. The core is made up, in this case, of poplar. It's a secondary wood. Now we visited a national forest just outside of Asheville, North Carolina, where they grow poplar trees, not far from the Biltmore estate where we found the dressing table. Well, I thought it was high time that you took a look at your land in North Carolina. That's right, you're looking at National Forest right off the Blue Ridge Parkway, and we're at a spot called Stony Bald. It's primarily a hardwood forest, red oak, ash, cherry, and there's a lot of poplar. Now the poplar is very interesting, as we found out from forester Eric Berg. Now, Eric, you're a Forest Service researcher, and you have the daunting task of taking care of this timberland just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. Why did you bring me to this plot today?
Norm, it's because we have 70 years of history here. We actually conducted an experiment here. We cut the forest to see how it would grow back.
Why did you do that?
Norm, back in the 1920s, the hardwood quality here was very poor, and so we wanted to see if it could be improved, so we cleared the trees to find out what would happen.
What did you do to bring it back? I mean, it looks great. It's pretty thick.
Norm, we actually did nothing. This response is all natural.
Really? Now, what kind of tree is this?
This is yellow poplar.
Nice and straight and tall. I've worked with this wood. It's great to work with. So it grows quickly?
Grows very fast, yes.
And it's tight together, so you get a good yield.
That's exactly right. Because it grows so straight and tall and has a narrow crown, you can get very high yields.
Now, let's say I want to buy this tree. Can I do that?
Norm, you really want to do that? I used to have hair before I used to get into this process, let me tell you. It's quite involved.
It's that tough?
Very much so. There's a long paper process to get to the point before we can sell National Forest timber.
So what happens?
Well, basically, we have to assess the environmental impacts of a timber sale on this site. That whole process can take years, a lot of paperwork. Then we finally have a decision made by our deciding official, David Loftus, the project leader, and his action can be appealed by the public. In addition, we can be taken to court. We can be litigated.
Hey, I just want to buy one tree for some projects. Let's assume I get through all of that. What happens next?
If you're successful, what happens next is that we'll designate which trees are to be removed. And then those trees, those logs, will be moved uphill with a line skidder to a road above to minimize the damages down here.
Because you want to let these other trees mature even more.
Precisely. We don't want any damage to the trail down here in the bottom as
All
well.
right. So how much is this tree worth? What's it going to cost?
On the stump today, this is worth roughly $100. By the time it gets to the mill, $200.
And what about if it becomes core for some plywood I might be buying?
Then you're going to pay the big bucks, Norm.
Really?
All right, Terry, send her down. We're ready.
Not far from where we saw the trees growing, we visited a logging operation where timber was being harvested to make plywood. It was interesting the way they did it. A tall steel pole is erected and equipped with a winch and a cable, which leads down the hill to the freshly cut trees. With power applied to the cable, a whole tree is then dragged uphill to the logging road. It's a much easier and gentler system than alternative methods, which involve tracked vehicles and having to build a lot of additional roads. Once the logs have been gathered onto trucks, it's a short ride over to the plywood mill. In order to understand how plywood is made, we've come to Old Fort, North Carolina. All of these logs are yellow poplar. That big machine moves them around, takes them to another location where the bark is removed and they're cut to length. Jeff Tuckey, the plant manager, points out that none of the bark, the chips, or the sawdust will go to waste. A lot of it ends up being made into particle board or paper products. Here, the debarked logs are bathed in hot water to soften them up for the lathe. And what a lathe it is. This machine is turning the whole log against a sharp knife, which reduces it to a ribbon of wood in seconds. I've never seen anything like it. At this station, defects are cut out of the ribbon of veneer. The operation happens quickly and is controlled by an overhead sensor and a computer. The remaining veneer is chopped into approximately 4-foot sections, but the scraps are not thrown away. Another conveyor line carries them here to this machine, where they are stitched into 4-foot sections with hot melt glue, a technique that any Yankee would admire. Throw nothing out. Now for the assembly, the plywood ballet. Watch as these 3 workers put the panels together. Now if we slow the process down, watch what is happening here. The two men in white are loading core panels onto the table. The man in blue takes another core which has just been glued on both sides. This continues until the lamination is complete and ready for the hardwood skins. Now watch the two men in white again. They now grab a pair of hardwood skins from the top of the pile. In this case, it's cherry. One will become the face veneer of a completed panel, the other the bottom of the next. You really need to pay attention on this job. So this is the whole sandwich, the bread, the cheese, the ham, the whole work.
That's right.
Then it's off to this vertical press where heat and pressure is applied to set the plywood panels. Up to now, the panels have been a little bit oversized. So here they are recut to finish width and length. An industrial strength belt sander is used here to dimension the thickness and to perfect the surface. Then it's off to quality control. Well, what's happening here, Jeff?
Well, Norm, this is the end of the line. This is where we'll strap up the load and ship it off. This is a load of cherry right here.
Boy, that's beautiful. It's one of my favorite woods. Well, thanks for the tour.
Well, you're very welcome, Norm. I appreciate you coming.
Now, I don't need this whole lift right away at the New Yankee Workshop. Half will do for now.
That's a lot of plywood.
I'm still waiting for the rest of that lift of plywood. So far, I've only got 6 sheets. Well, that was a very interesting story. Meanwhile, back here, I've been sizing the pieces for the top. I've kept them in sequential order so the grain will match when it's all finished. I'm going to have to conceal the core edges of the plywood, and I'll do that with some solid 1-inch strips of mahogany mitered at the corners. But before I do that, I want to show you what's going on under this center panel where I have to do a little more work. The mirror is hinged at the top and has this little prop which supports it at this angle. In order for the prop to have someplace to go when the mirror is closed, I had to route out this center section. And in order to provide some more room for the mirror frame, I made a shallow 1/8 inch cut around the perimeter. I'll do that first. To create the relief area for the mirror frame, I'm using the dado head. It's set at 1/8 of an inch height, and I'll have to make a couple passes. I've just laid out for this recess for the mirror support, and I'm going to remove that material using my router. Now, the first thing that I did is I made a little gauge block, and that's equal to the distance from the edge of my router base to the edge of the bit. And what that does for me is it makes it unnecessary to measure every time I set up this straight edge. I simply set the gauge to the line, lock it in place. Now I guide the router and start removing the material. With the perimeter outlined, now it's just a matter of taking a chisel and popping out the section in the middle. Well, now it's time to trim out the edges of all the plywood top pieces. So I've ripped some 1-inch stock, carefully mitered the corners, and cut biscuit slots both in the plywood and the solid trim. Now I adjusted the slot so that the solid wood will be just slightly higher than the veneer. If it was lower and I went to sand everything even, I just burn right through it. This way I'll bring the wood, solid wood, to the plywood. Let's take another look at the prototype and this mirror support. It's hinged on some tiny hinges, and the joint is just a simple half lap. By simply using my saw blade, I just nibble away the material at each half lap. right, a little bit of glue on the half flap. And let me just tap them together. I don't think I'll need any clamps for this. Here I've installed a 1/2-inch cove bit in my router table, and I've machined a finger pull on the bottom inside edge of the mirror. That way it'll be easier to lift it forward. Here I'm mortising for the hinges that will allow the mirror to pivot. I've just scored a line with a mat knife. I'm removing the bulk of the material with my router, and I'll clean it up with a sharp chisel. Now these little hinges are going to attach the support to the back of the mirror frame. These mortises are for hinges that are going to attach the center frame to the top. Well, I still have a little more mortising, a few more pieces of hardware to put on, and some final sanding, plus putting on a finish. But it's getting late, so that can wait till tomorrow. I don't want to rush it. Hi again. A lot of progress already this morning. The first thing that I did was to make some corresponding mortises in the top to receive the hinges from the mirror assembly. Next, I made a mortise for this piece of hardware. This is the piece that keeps the mirror assembly from tipping back too far. I used a straight edge and a 3/8-inch bit in my plunge router. Made a mortise about 3/4 of an inch deep, so that piece fits in like that. And then I made a corresponding hole in the mirror assembly for this plug, which gets epoxied in later. The next thing that I did was to work on some bullet catches that hold the mirror from falling down. One piece goes in the side of the mirror, another piece goes in the outer frame. The next thing that I want to do is treat the edges of the top. Cut a profile over at the router table. For the top edge, I've used an OG bit. Now I'm going to change bits and take care of the bottom edge with a 1/4 round. Okay, now with a little glue on the inside of that mirror frame, I can attach it to the center section of the top. And carefully line it up, making sure the edges are flush, and secure it with some 1 1/4-inch brads. This is a little trim piece that I'm installing right here down at the bottom edge of that outer frame. It has a finger cut out, and I made that the same way I made the one in the mirror frame. I'll just attach it with a couple brads. Okay, now I'm attaching the whole mirror and center top assembly to the base, just reinstalling the screws in the hinge. Now, I'm in no hurry to epoxy this piece of hardware into the top. I'll do that after I do the finishing. I want this out of the way. Now we just close it down, and that takes care of the center. Now I've taken a few minutes to install the end panels of the top. I carefully adjust it to this center section, which can't move now. so that I have a nice even gap, and I secure them with some 1 5/8" screws through some pre-drilled holes. The first step in finishing our dressing table is to stain it. I'm using an oil-based stain. The color is mahogany. Most antique pieces that you see that are built out of mahogany tend to be really dark. So putting on this stain will give us that look. Now I simply apply a nice even coat on each area, let it set for a few minutes, and then take a rag and wipe off the excess. After I get the complete table done, we'll let it sit overnight. Okay, now for a top coat. And what I'm using is probably what was used on that antique at the Biltmore estate, shellac. I like using shellac because it dries very quickly, so fast that it doesn't. And I can do it very quickly between coats because it dries so fast. Well, this should be the final coat of shellac. I've been blocking the piece down with some microfine paper between coats. After this dries, we'll be ready for the hardware. The first piece of hardware that I'm going to put on are these solid brass casters, very similar to the ones we saw on the antique at Biltmore. I was able to order them from my mail-order woodworker's catalog. I got lucky on the knobs. These replicas are very close to the ones on the original. Found out the hard way that I have to pre-drill for these nails before I put the mirror in. And then I just use a dowel to push it in enough just to hold it. Well, there it is, the dressing table. Maybe I'll call my friends down at the Biltmore estate. Who knows? They may want to put it on display. It was a fun project to build, and it's going to become an heirloom in my family.